My name is Callum Hayes. I'm 29, and for most of my life the running joke at family gatherings has been me. I learned early that some people don't laugh because something's funny. They laugh to make sure you know where you stand. In my family, there was a seating chart you couldn't see. My sister Nora at the center with the bright career and the perfect smile. My brother Ethan orbiting our dad's approval like a moon that never dares drift. My mother arranging napkins into swans while pretending ignorance is kindness. My Aunt Lorraine armed with gossip and a glass of sweet tea that was never just tea. And me, Callum, somewhere near the folding chairs. Useful only when a printer jammed or someone needed a Wi-Fi password. Whenever I got a text about a reunion, it felt less like an invitation and more like a summons, the kind where you already know you'll have to prove you belong in a room that still calls you the one who didn't finish. If you ask my family, my reputation started with sophomore year of college when I withdrew 2 weeks after midterms. They'll tell you I gave up and ran off and made a mess, because that version is easy to fold into a story they already believed about me. The truth was a lot less dramatic and a lot lonelier. A professor pulled me aside and explained that my financial aid package had changed, a paperwork hiccup that would likely be resolved next semester. Except the math didn't lie. The money was gone now. Bills were immediate, rent didn't negotiate, and my part-time job at a campus cafe couldn't cover a black hole. I let the registrar print out the withdrawal form and walked home with the paper in my pocket, telling myself it would just be 1 semester off. That's not how my family remembers it. He quit college to chase some scheme, Aunt Lorraine likes to say. Our stories split there and never found their way back. After I left school, I worked 2 jobs, then 3. I learned to repair phones at a strip mall kiosk under humming lights that made your skin look gray. I drove a battered sedan at night with a back seat that smelled like fries and spilled soda. I slept 5 hours on good days and dreamed in numbers. Rent due on the 1st, loan interest due on the 15th, a paycheck that hit at 12:03 a.m. if the payroll system felt generous. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I was on the off-ramp and just hadn't found the lane again. What I didn't say out loud was that sometimes I liked the work. There was a pattern to making broken things whole. A cracked screen becomes a glass pane again. A dead battery wakes up at 87%. Sitting hunched over a tiny board with tweezers and solder, I could concentrate in a way that made the rest of the world dim. It felt like solving a puzzle everyone else had decided wasn't worth their time. The first time I told my dad I could fix his phone instead of him buying a new one, he frowned at the kitchen table and said, "You're not a technician, Callum. You're a kid who never finished what he started." He didn't mean it as cruelly as it landed. In my house, statements like that were considered neutral facts. Mom slipped a casserole into the oven and said, bright as ever, "Well, maybe a professional should take a look, sweetie. We wouldn't want to make it worse." That was how love sounded there, like careful steering away from the thing you were trying to say. By dessert, Aunt Lorraine was texting herself reminders to share the update with cousins. "He's doing phone screens now. Poor thing." I watched the family group chat light up with sympathetic thumbs and shocked faces, and then flipped my phone face down. You learn to set your own notifications. What you'll let in, what you'll ignore. People say your 20s are for experimenting. Mine were for shutting doors softly and walking away. I stopped bringing girlfriends to holidays. I stopped applying for jobs that required a degree because I could hear my father's sigh in the margins of every application. Instead, I got good, quietly good, at a narrow thing almost nobody else cared about. I learned board-level repairs. I learned data recovery. I learned that small businesses bled cash when their point-of-sale machines died on a Saturday. I learned that if you could show up on time, return devices when you promised, and speak to people without making them feel stupid, you could negotiate your own price. Word of mouth did what family never tried to do. There's a kind of humility that grows in the cracks where approval should have been. I cultivated it without even knowing. I rented a workbench in the back of a computer shop owned by a retired teacher who thought the world of me, because unlike my family, he liked the version of me who existed in plain sight. On paper, I was still the kid who left school. On invoices, I was the guy who saved a school's attendance records and kept a bakery open after a lightning strike. Those felt like 2 different people until, slowly, they became the same one. When Nora got engaged last winter, the family group chat turned into a fireworks show. Everyone had opinions about venues and color palettes and photographers. Dad promised to cover the bar. Mom started a Pinterest board. Ethan offered to take care of the playlist, like he was volunteering for war. I typed congratulations and sent a gift I could afford. A private session with a chef I did some recovery work for, who owed me a favor and genuinely liked Nora. She was the only one who sometimes texted me on random Tuesdays to ask how my week was going. The only person who occasionally said, "You know, Callum, you're really good at what you do." That meant something, even if I never said so. It was Nora who called the morning of the reunion and said, "You're coming, right? Please say yes." It wasn't actually about the reunion. It was about the wedding. She wanted the whole family on neutral ground before we all collided in tuxedos and seating charts. It would mean a lot, she added. She has my mother's voice, but not the habit of arranging the truth, so it looks nicer. I hesitated. Then I pictured her fiancé, Mark, who I'd met twice. A tall, polite civil engineer with steady eyes who listened more than he spoke. He asked questions the way people ask if they can pet your dog, aware of boundaries, respectful, interested if invited. I got the sense he hadn't been to many Hayes reunions. I said yes. The reunion was at my Aunt Lorraine's house, which looks like a magazine layout, the kind that insists every surface should have a bowl on it. The front lawn hadn't a single rebellious blade of grass. The kitchen was already hot from the oven and the gossip. I parked down the street and sat in my car for 1 minute longer than necessary. It's the ritual you do before a place that has decided who you are. I took a breath, then another. The rearview mirror showed a face I sometimes didn't recognize, a little older, jaw a shade tighter. Then I got out and walked toward the noise. Lorraine met me at the door because of course she did. "Don't expect any respect here. You're still the failure who never finished college," she said, smiling the way people smile when they think honesty equals virtue. Her perfume drifted out first, then her bracelet clinked as she stepped aside, a tiny bell to summon the room's attention. Behind her, I could see heads tilt. Cousins noted my shoes. An uncle raised his brows as if checking whether I'd dressed up enough to fail in. My mother looked away as if someone had called her from a different room. My father, who always stands with one hand in his pocket and one on a drink, did both, which is a trick I still don't understand. "Happy reunion to you too," I said lightly. If there is a uniform for surviving family gatherings, mine is the easy tone, the shrug that says none of this lands. I stepped inside, kissed my mother's cheek, shook my father's hand. He squeezed too long, which is his way of saying behave. Ethan clapped my shoulder like I was a co-worker he'd decided to tolerate and leaned in. "Just don't embarrass us tonight, okay?" He said it quietly, for my benefit, as though he was doing me a favor by keeping the insult personal. "Wouldn't dream of it," I replied, and he laughed like we were sharing a joke. Maybe we were. I wasn't sure which of us was meant to be the punchline. The first hour was a choreography of small talk and thinly veiled comparisons. Lorraine pressed a lemonade into my hand and announced loudly, "Non-alcoholic for Callum," as if I had ever had a public incident to justify that choice. A cousin my age asked if I'd found anything stable yet, with a sympathy tilt to her head, like she was talking to someone who had recently lost a pet. My uncle asked if I still tinkered with gadgets, and before I could answer, my father chuckled and said, "He keeps busy." The words hung under the ceiling fan like a fruit that never ripens. I nodded and changed the subject to sports I didn't follow because that made everyone more comfortable. Nora found me by the deviled eggs, pressed a quick hug into my side, and whispered, "I'm sorry." In that way siblings do when they're apologizing for something much bigger than a moment. Her fiancé, Mark, hovered nearby, doing that calm, attentive thing of his, asking her mother about flower arrangements, helping move a cooler without being asked. He saw me and brightened. "Hey, Callum," he said, putting out a hand. A normal handshake, a human handshake, not a measuring contest. "Glad you could make it." He meant it, which was rare currency in that room. I stayed close to the edges. Old habits. It's easier to exit from there if you need to, and you can see incoming weather. The kitchen island became the center of gravity, cold salads, a honey-baked ham, a plate of crackers arranged like dominoes. Someone had put a framed photo of my grandparents on the counter, and their faces looked fresher than anyone in the room. They'd had these reunions too, I realized. Different menu, same theater. At some point, conversations braided into bigger ones. Someone retold the story of how Nora landed her new job, with the details inflated just enough to make my mother's eyes shine. Ethan announced he was maybe moving up at his firm and let the maybe dangle like bait. There was a toast to Nora and Mark's upcoming wedding, which became a second toast when Lorraine realized the first hadn't included a pointed message about families sticking together no matter what. I lifted my glass with everyone else and swallowed lemonade that had gone warm in my hand. Then came the tiny shift, the one that always starts the avalanche. Lorraine's neighbor stepped in with a casserole, and because I was nearest the door, I took it. "Careful," she said, surprised. "Wow, strong. What do you do, young man?" It was innocent. She didn't know the language we speak in that house, the script that says you may ask Nora about her team and Ethan about his clients, but you ask me only about the weather. I repair and recover data, I said before I could package it into something smaller. I run a small operation. I cut off the extra words, the ones that would have sounded like bragging or defense, and set the casserole down. Lorraine's ear twitched. My father's gaze slid over without turning his head. You could feel the temperature change by a degree. Recover data? Mark asked, curious. Like for phones? Or companies? His tone didn't have skepticism in it. It had interest, which is a difference my family taught me to register like a weather warning. I nodded. Both, I said. Mostly small businesses. Schools. Medical practices. I was preparing to divert, to ask him about a bridge he was working on or a road project that had surprised him, when Aunt Lorraine's voice, bright as a chandelier, cut through. He's being modest, she sang, and for a moment my heart weirdly lifted, because Lorraine never called me modest. Then she added, he's very good at tinkering. We keep him around because he can fix the toaster. Laughter. Not cruel. Exactly. Just easy, and at my expense. The neighbor smiled politely, unsure. My mother shifted a napkin. My father sipped his drink. I have learned there are options in a moment like that. You can correct the record. It will be taken as aggression. You can joke back. It will be filed under defensive and repeated later as proof that you cannot take a joke. You can leave. That becomes a story someone else gets to tell. Or you can do what I did, which is smile with your eyes and not your teeth, and let it pass through you like weather. The toaster never thanks me, I said lightly. I'm still waiting on a card. It got a ripple. The neighbor laughed. The moment slid by, but a note had been struck, and the song had started. Dinner found me next to Mark at the long table, while Nora ran point on courses and conversation. Lorraine had placed me there. I could tell by the place cards, between Mark and a cousin who collects other people's business like charms on a bracelet. Across from me, my father held court with Ethan, performing competence by talking about things he didn't build. Mark leaned in, quiet. Can I ask you more about your work? He said, voice low enough that it didn't carry. I nodded. He asked good questions, not the kind that look for weak spots, but the kind that cost time and attention. I gave careful answers. He was about to ask another when Nora's maid of honor, one of those people who is always popping over, dropped into the empty chair on Mark's other side. So what do you do? She asked me, not unkindly, just loudly, because that's her volume and because she had no idea that the table had rules. Around us, forks paused. Heads turned on instinct. There it was again, the start of weather. I felt my aunt's ears perk from 3 seats away. I heard Ethan's breath hitch, because he loved these moments, little stages where I was supposed to trip. My father's eyes went soft in that way he did when he braced for what he considered my overcomplication of simple questions. Mom smiled tightly and pressed her palm flat on the tablecloth like she could smooth the room. I repair and recover data, I said again, gently. I run a small shop, plus some consulting. The maid of honor blinked. Consulting for who? And before I could flatten the truth into something that fit the timeline everyone had written for me, Mark, noticing the puzzle in my answer and the heat of the room, did what engineers do. He reached for his phone to find a reference point. What's your business called? He asked, casual, curious, simply trying to complete a picture. I told him the name. He typed it into the search bar. The screen lit his face. The table noise thinned into a clear, high silence, the kind that comes right before a glass tips or the power goes out. And while he waited for the results to load, I watched something move across his expression, a small shift of recognition, then focus, then something sharper I couldn't name yet. He looked from the phone up to me, as if to confirm that we were talking about the same person. Across the table, I could feel my aunt leaning, my brother smirking, my father's hand tightening around his fork. Mark's thumb hovered, 1 inch above a link I knew too well. Mark's thumb hovered over the link, but before he could tap it, Lorraine's voice cut in like a knife. Careful what you look up, Mark, she trilled, lifting her glass. You might get bored scrolling through stories of broken microwaves and secondhand laptops. A ripple of laughter followed, cousins snickering like kids at the back of a classroom. Ethan leaned in across the table with a smirk that said he couldn't wait to watch me squirm. Yeah, let's not embarrass him, he added. We all know Callum's career path is kind of a family mystery. Mom pretended to fuss with the salt shaker, her silence a signal that she wouldn't step in. Dad tapped his fork against his plate, the metallic click carrying more weight than words. It was his way of saying, don't escalate, don't make a scene. I felt my face heat, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep my expression neutral. Years of practice had taught me the art of stillness, how to take the barbs without giving them the satisfaction of watching you bleed. Meanwhile, Nora's eyes flicked between me and Mark, silently pleading for calm. She knew what was coming. Every reunion had its script, and I was always cast as the character who never measured up. Lorraine leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to make the words sharper. It's sweet, really. Everyone needs a hobby. Keeps him out of trouble. Across the table, one cousin muttered something about me, still living paycheck to paycheck, loud enough for others to hear. Forks clinked, heads shook, and the air thickened with that familiar mix of pity and amusement. I wanted to vanish. But part of me, quiet, stubborn, also wanted to hold my ground. I looked at Mark, who still had his phone in hand, the screen glowing faintly. His brows were furrowed now, but not in mockery. He looked curious, maybe even unsettled. "So," he said carefully, "you handle data recovery?" He emphasized the last two words, like he was trying to drag the conversation back to neutral ground. Lorraine rolled her eyes and raised her voice again. "Mark, darling, don't encourage him. He'll start talking in acronyms and wires, and we'll all die of boredom before dessert." The table chuckled. My father finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "Let's not get carried away." On the surface it was a call for peace, but I knew the subtext. "Callum, swallow it down. Don't push back. Don't ruin the evening." My chest tightened as I stared at my plate. For years, I'd done just that. Kept quiet, let them shape my narrative into something pathetic and unfinished. Tonight, though, something felt different. Maybe it was Nora's pleading glance, or Mark's steady gaze, or the simple fact that I was tired of being reduced to a caricature every time I walked through this door. But still, I stayed silent. For now, that silence gave them permission to keep going. Ethan leaned back in his chair, grinning. "You know what's funny?" he said, voice rising. "Every time I go out, someone asks if I'm related to Callum. I never know what to say. I mean, what would you tell people if your brother was fixing coffee machines for a living?" The cousins roared. Lorraine covered her mouth like she'd just heard the most scandalous secret. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. Dad sipped his drink without looking at me. The laughter echoed around the table, and I could feel myself shrinking into the same corner I'd occupied for years. But then I caught Mark glancing at his phone again, his thumb tapping, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he read. His expression shifted from curiosity to something colder, sharper. He looked at me, then at the rest of the table, and I realized he had found what they were all too blind, or too unwilling, to see. And that's where the tension began to thrum, louder than their laughter. The laughter around the table hadn't even died down when Ethan decided to twist the knife. He leaned back in his chair, the smugness practically dripping from his grin. "Actually," he said, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "You know what's really crazy? Last year, Dad almost had to cover one of Callum's bills because he was short on rent. Isn't that right?" He looked at me with mock innocence, as if daring me to deny it. The room went quiet in that way it always does before a storm. Forks frozen halfway to mouths, eyes darting between me and my father. I clenched my jaw, because I knew exactly what he was referring to. Months ago, before one of my biggest contracts had come through, I'd asked Dad, not for money, but for a short-term loan I intended to pay back in full. He'd refused, and that was the end of it. Or so I thought. I'd kept that conversation private, humiliating as it already was. But now Ethan had dragged it out into the open, twisting the truth into something poisonous. "Don't look so surprised," Ethan chuckled, glancing at my cousins. "Some people just never figure it out. You can't rely on dreams to pay the bills." My face burned, and for a split second, I thought I might actually stand up and leave. But then Dad cleared his throat, his voice calm but edged with disappointment. "It's true," he said flatly. "Callum came to me when he was in trouble. I told him he needed to stand on his own 2 feet. We don't reward failure in this family." Failure. The word landed like a brick in my chest. And the worst part? He didn't even sound angry, just resigned, like it was an immutable fact of my existence. Mom tried to jump in with a nervous laugh, saying, "Well, it all worked out, didn't it? But the damage was already done." My cousins were whispering. Lorraine wore a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Nora's eyes widened, flashing between me and Dad, and Mark froze mid-bite, his phone still lit up beside his plate. I stared at my father, the betrayal heavier than anything Ethan could have thrown at me. He hadn't needed to confirm it. He could have brushed it off, defended me, or simply said nothing. But instead, he chose to humiliate me in front of everyone, using my lowest moment as proof that I was exactly who they believed me to be. "Stand on my own 2 feet," I repeated softly, my voice steady but low. My father didn't meet my eyes. He just reached for his glass again, as if the matter was settled. That was the turning point. Something inside me shifted, like a door slamming shut. For years, I'd tolerated the snide remarks, the digs, the sideways glances. But hearing my father, my own father, label me as a failure, not in private, but as a public declaration to everyone at the table, was the moment I realized the gulf between us wasn't just wide. It was permanent. And just as that thought settled in my chest, Mark finally tapped the link on his phone. His eyes widened as the page loaded, and I watched his face drain of color. Whatever he had just seen, it wasn't the story Lorraine and Ethan had been peddling. He looked at me like he was seeing someone completely different, and the silence that followed was heavier than the betrayal itself.